Hey gang, welcome back to Mondays at the Museum. I'm Carrie and I'm here at the Anna Bemis Palmer Museum. So last week we talked about our founder, Anna Bemis Palmer, and today we're going to talk about her husband, Orlando Gray Palmer. So we're just going to hit the highlights of his life. He did leave a very adventurous one, and I could probably go on for hours and hours, and you probably don't have hours and hours, so hopefully you're free for the next 5 minutes or so. So, Orlando Gray Palmer. He was born September 22nd, 1864 in Marion, Iowa. His parents were David Lindley Palmer and Delsina Melissa Gray. So in our collection, we have this really cool clipping from the York News Times, which is the paper here in town, and they interviewed his houseboy. And according to the houseboy, Orlando actually ran away from his parents' farm when he was 10 years old, and he hitchhiked using buggies and wagons all the way till Florida. And he chose Florida because he heard that they were recruiting for the army there. So the officers were so impressed with his efforts to get there that one of them actually made him his drummer boy. And Orlando didn't have any experience playing the drum, but he learned very quickly. And then depending on the rhythm that he played, he would be telling the men to either do things like assemble or move your horses, which I think is pretty neat. None of that is in the obituary, mind you, but it was told to his houseboy by Orlando himself and repeated then in that newspaper article, which I think is really neat. So nobody is sure how long he stayed in Florida, but records show that he was back in Kansas 13 years later because he graduated from Kansas State Agricultural College. After that, he went on to get his master's degree in law at Columbia University, which is now known as George Washington University in Washington, D.C. For a while, he practiced law in Kansas, and then he moved to Oklahoma, where he served as chief clerk of the Senate, and he also taught history and civics at the University of Oklahoma. He married a lady named Hattie Hobbs. She was the mother of all of his children, unfortunately 2 of which did die in infancy, but there were 2 that survived, Lenore and Corinne, and they both ended up marrying military men. Imagine that. It was there in Oklahoma that he joined Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Yes, those Rough Riders, many of whom were recruited from the frontier. So as a Rough Rider, he was the first sergeant with the Oklahoma Rough Riders, Troop D, 1st U.S. Cavalry, and they went to Cuba in 1898 to participate in the Spanish-American War. He is listed, according to his military records, as having a light complexion, brown eyes, dark gray hair, and standing at 5 foot 8 inches. Palmer often talked about Roosevelt to his houseboy, as one does, and he liked to use the phrase "hell's bells, man," which he supposedly borrowed from Teddy himself. So after all of that, he became an officer in the Army in 1901. His serial number, for those of you interested, was 01606. So he served twice in Cuba, twice in the Philippines, plus spending time in Mexico, England, and France during World War I. So for France, he organized and instructed the 320th Machine Gun Battalion of the 82nd Division and was in command of that regiment, which was made up of 105 officers and 3,000 enlisted men. The 1910 census has him living at Fort Riley Military Reservation in Geary County, Kansas, with his wife Hattie and his daughters Lenore and Corinne. Lenore was 17 and Corinne was 9 at the time. He then became a recruiting officer in Detroit, Michigan from 1919 till 1921, and then his rank was captain. After that, he moved to D.C. until 1924, and then he retired from active duty with the rank of lieutenant colonel of the cavalry on January 6, 1925. Orlando seems to be really the only tangible link that Nebraska has to the Rough Riders, so it's actually really cool that we have so many of his things. In the 1930s, he lived in Leavenworth, Kansas, and was listed as a lawyer. His wife, Hattie, died August 26th of 1939, and she's buried there in Kansas at the Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. So now we get to Anna Bemis Palmer, who is our founder. It seems at some point he migrated from there to Nebraska and that he and Anna started courting. I don't know the exact history on how that started, but they were cousins, which is how you did things back then. And they worked together for many years on a genealogical research of their family, the Gray family, and the Gray family all through America. Their home basically reflected the ancestry of their families, and it was filled with all these relics from their family and from Nebraska and from the nation. And that's how the museum got started, was just they collected all these things and preserved them, and it just kind of built up from there. So as for Orlando and Anna, according to the houseboy, Orlando actually never learned to drive because he was an officer, so he always had a driver. So Anna would come and pick him up in her big boxy Chevy or Buick, that part's unclear, but she would pick him up and take him to the doctor or out to dinner. And Orlando knew how to play the banjo and played the banjo for Anna, which I think is really cute. They got married in 1944, but then the colonel died May 31st, 1950. He was interred June 2nd, 1950 at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery, and there he's buried with his first wife, Hattie. So for those of you wondering what kind of artifacts I say that I have when it comes to Orlando, there are some really neat things in our collection that are very Rough Rider-ish. Might possibly have a signed letter with his appointment to the Rough Riders, maybe some other pretty important signed documents. I don't want to give too much away, so I'm just gonna say you're just gonna have to come and visit us when we open. So anyway, that's all we got today about Orlando Gray Palmer, and I will see you next week for the next edition of Mondays at the Museum.